Try organizing a group hunt for a dangerous animal without saying a single word. No talking, no shouting directions, just hands, faces, and whatever you can act out in the moment. That's not a thought experiment. For a huge stretch of human history, that was just Tuesday. Here's the part that catches people off guard. Nobody knows exactly when full human language showed up. Not the year, not even the century. Estimates from linguists and archaeologists vary wildly, and it's genuinely debated among researchers. Some scholars point to signs of basic proto-language going back over a million years, in much older relatives like Homo erectus. Others argue real, full language, as we'd recognize, it only showed up alongside our own species, Homo sapiens, somewhere in the range of 100,000 to 135,000 years ago. That gap matters because Homo sapiens as a species is roughly 230,000 years old, which means there's a real possibility that for tens of thousands of years, maybe more, our own species existed without anything close to full structured language. Same brains, same bodies, no settled answer yet on exactly when the talking started. So picture that stretch of time. Bands of early humans, hunting, gathering, raising children, surviving genuinely dangerous environments, all without the tool most of us can't imagine living a single day without. How does any of that even work? One major theory, supported by quite a few researchers, points to gesture. The idea is that hands came first, not words. Pointing, miming, acting things out with your whole body, long before anyone figured out how to turn sound into shared meaning. There's a reasonably intuitive case for this. Watch any toddler today before they can really talk. They point at what they want. They wave goodbye. They reach toward a parent with both arms when they want to be picked up. Some researchers see that as a kind of living fossil, a leftover pattern from a much older stage of human communication. This idea isn't new either. Long before modern genetics or brain scans existed, thinkers in the 18th century were already arguing that gesture must have come before speech, simply by watching how naturally and instinctively people reached for their hands whenever words failed them. The idea fell out of fashion for a while, then came roaring back in the 20th century once researchers started taking primate communication seriously as a real source of evidence rather than a curiosity. There's also a strange physical clue some researchers have pointed to. Human palms and the skin around our fingernails tend to be lighter than the rest of our skin, a trait not really seen in other primates. One researcher who studied this theory extensively suggested it might have evolved specifically to make our hand gestures easier to spot, almost like built-in highlighting for a body part doing a lot of communicative heavy lifting. It's a small, almost throwaway detail about our own bodies that most people have never once thought about, yet it sits there on every single hand as a quiet little clue about how we might have once gotten our points across. Other researchers push back hard on the idea that gesture came first and speech came later, in a clean two-step process. Some argue the evidence doesn't strongly support gestures preceding vocal communication as a separate, earlier stage. Instead, they suggest gesture and voice likely developed together, intertwined from early on, neither one waiting around for the other to finish first. This is, very much, an active and unresolved debate, not a settled fact. Researchers on both sides of this argument continue publishing new evidence, and there isn't a clean consensus answer that's likely to satisfy everyone anytime soon. Either way, here's a useful experiment that gives a clue about how early humans might have managed complex tasks without full spoken language. Researchers studying how ancient stone tools were made ran a fascinating test. They had modern volunteers try to learn how to make a basic stone tool using only one of three methods: spoken instructions alone, gesture alone, or a combination of speech and gesture together. Results are genuinely surprising. People who only received spoken instructions with no demonstration actually performed worse than people who learned purely through watching gestures and physical demonstration. Combining speech and gesture together didn't dramatically outperform gesture alone either. In other words, for a hands-on physical skill like shaping a stone tool, watching someone do it turned out to be just as useful, sometimes more useful, than having someone try to describe it out loud. Think about how counterintuitive that actually is. Most of us assume that talking through a task is the most efficient way to teach somebody something. Tell them the steps, walk them through the logic, done. But this research suggests that for hands-on physical skills, words alone can actually get in the way, slowing things down compared to simply watching closely and copying what you see. That single result reframes the whole question. A world without spoken language wasn't necessarily a world where nobody could teach anybody anything complicated. Skills like tool-making, which required passing detailed physical knowledge from one generation to the next, may have worked perfectly well through demonstration and gesture alone, long before full language ever entered the picture. An entire toolkit of survival skills, sharpening stones, building shelter, preparing food, could plausibly have been passed down for hundreds of generations without anyone ever needing to put a single sentence together. What about emotional connection, though? Comfort, warning, group bonding, the things language feels essential for today. This is where things get genuinely speculative, and researchers are upfront about how much remains uncertain. Some scientists who study primate behavior point to vocal sounds, rhythmic lip movements, and shared physical actions, like grooming, as possible building blocks for some of these social functions, long before anything resembling spoken sentences existed. Other primates today still rely heavily on these same kinds of signals, fixed calls, facial expressions, physical touch, to manage group cohesion, warn of danger, and maintain social bonds. If early humans relied on a similar toolkit, stretched and adapted over enormous spans of time, a lot of the core social glue that keeps a group functioning could plausibly have existed well before anyone uttered anything resembling a modern sentence. Not identical to language, not nearly as flexible or expressive, but functional enough to hold a small group together through real, sustained cooperation. A frightened cry, a low warning sound, a reassuring touch on the arm, none of these require grammar, yet all of them carry real, urgent meaning that a group could act on immediately. It's worth remembering that none of this happened in isolation from the rest of a person's life. Raising children, sharing food, defending against predators, navigating disputes within the group, all of it presumably ran on the same patchwork of gesture, sound, expression, and shared attention. It wasn't a lesser version of communication waiting to be replaced. For the people living through it, it was simply communication, full stop, the only kind they had ever known. Then sometime within that broad, debated window researchers keep narrowing down, something shifted. Around 100,000 years ago, give or take, the archaeological record shows a noticeable jump in symbolic behavior, deliberate engravings on objects, the use of fire to deliberately produce ochre, a reddish pigment that shows up again and again in contexts that suggest decoration or ritual rather than pure survival necessity. These aren't proof of language on their own, but most researchers agree that this kind of abstract, symbolic thinking is closely tied to the same mental machinery language requires. Some researchers, including the team behind a widely discussed recent genetic study, argue the underlying biological capacity for full language may have already existed even earlier, potentially around 135,000 years ago, based on patterns in how human populations genetically diverged and spread across the world. Their argument is that since every known human population today has fully developed language, with no exceptions found anywhere, the basic capacity for it was probably already in place before early groups of Homo sapiens first began splitting apart and spreading across different regions. If language had developed after that initial split, the researchers reason, you'd expect to find at least one isolated population somewhere with no language, or with something radically different from everyone else. Nobody has ever found that. Every population studied has fully developed linguistic ability, which strongly suggests the capacity was already shared before groups went their separate ways. Not every researcher agrees with this interpretation, and that disagreement is worth sitting with rather than glossing over. Some scholars argue language developed more gradually, evolving alongside tool use, social coordination, and growing material culture, rather than appearing as one single dramatic turning point that then triggered everything else. In that view, language wasn't necessarily the spark that lit the fire. It might have grown up right alongside everything else humans were already doing, each piece reinforcing the others slowly over time, rather than one single breakthrough, changing everything overnight. What almost everyone studying this topic does agree on is this. For an enormous stretch of human existence, possibly tens of thousands of years, our ancestors were already organizing hunts, raising children, making tools, and forming lasting social bonds using something other than the kind of structured spoken language we rely on every single day without a second thought. It's a strange thing to sit with. An entire chapter of the human story, stretching across tens of thousands of years, and probably more generations than anyone could ever count, happened almost entirely off the record in terms of spoken words. No song lyrics survive from that time. No spoken stories were ever recorded for us to hear today. Whatever jokes existed, whatever comfort was offered to a grieving parent, whatever instructions were given before a dangerous hunt, all of it lived only in the moment it happened, passed along through gesture and sound, and then gone, leaving only the physical objects and bones behind as faint clues for us to argue over today. So the next time a conversation feels effortless, worth remembering that the ease itself is the unusual part, not the obvious default. For most of the time, humans have existed on this planet, Getting an idea across to another person took hands, faces, patience, and an enormous amount of shared attention, built up slowly, body to body, long before anyone had figured out exactly how to wrap that meaning into a single spoken word.